The ER at 3 a.m. smells like copper, stale vomit, and burnt coffee. It's a fluorescent graveyard of bad decisions. Clara wiped someone else's blood off her scrubs and stared at the old man in Bay 6. He was dying. The doctor didn't care. But the military escort was already on its way. The linoleum floor of St. Jude's emergency department was perpetually sticky. It didn't matter how many times the janitorial staff ran the industrial buffers over it. A thin film of dried fluids, spilled saline, and pulverized dirt always remained. Clara's rubber-soled clogs peeled off the floor with a rhythmic schlick. Schlick as she walked toward the nurse's station. It was 3:14 a.m. The dreaded hour. The waiting room had finally thinned out, leaving only the stragglers, a teenager nursing a sprained wrist from a skateboard accident, a woman crying softly over a toothache, and the man in Bay 6. Clara pressed the heels of her hands into her tired eyes. Her lower back throbbed, a dull, persistent ache that had moved in 5 years ago and never left. She was 42, 12 years into her career as an ER nurse, and the chronic exhaustion had etched permanent, bruised-looking shadows under her eyes. She reached for her lukewarm coffee, the paper cup soft and degrading at the rim. Vitals on the Vagrant in 6? The voice belonged to Dr. Gregory Collins. He was 28, fresh out of his residency, and wore his arrogance like a freshly pressed suit. He hadn't yet learned the crucial difference between textbook medicine and the unpredictable reality of human bodies. His white coat was pristine, entirely devoid of the stains that mapped Clara's night. "His name is Arthur," Clara said, not looking up from her monitor. Her keyboard was tacky under her fingertips. Blood pressure is 110/70. Heart rate is 82. Temperature normal. Collins sighed, a sharp, nasal sound. He leaned against the counter, tapping a pen against his knuckles. "So, he's stable. What's the complaint? He smells like a wet dog and cheap bourbon. If he's just looking for a cot to sleep off a bender, we need to turf him out. We need the bed." Clara finally looked over at him. "He's not drunk, Dr. Collins. I didn't smell alcohol on him." He said his jaw hurts. "And he's got this. Look." Collins stopped tapping his pen. He raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "A look. You're diagnosing him with a look, Clara?" "He's ashen," Clara said, her voice dropping a register, a subtle plea for the young doctor to actually listen. "He's sweating, but his skin is freezing. He says it feels like someone is sitting on his shoulders. The ECG is technically normal, but the T waves in V2 and V3 are borderline. They look peaked." "They're normal variants," Collins dismissed, waving a hand. He pulled up Arthur's file on the screen next to Clara. "He's an old man with bad teeth who probably slept under a bridge. Jaw pain is likely an abscess or tension. The chest heaviness is heartburn. Give him a GI cocktail, a dose of ibuprofen, and discharge him. He's wasting our time." Clara felt a familiar, sour twist in her gut. It was the friction between protocol and instinct. The textbook said Arthur was fine. The algorithm said Arthur was low risk. But Clara had spent over a decade watching people die. She knew the smell of impending doom. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal shift in the room's atmosphere, a sudden stillness, a specific, grayish pallor that crept up a patient's neck. "Arthur had it. I really think we should keep him," Clara said. Her voice was steady, but her heart bumped against her ribs. She hated confronting attendings. It rarely went well. "Let's draw a troponin. Let's just hold him for observation for 2 hours. Just to be sure." Collins pushed off the counter. The air between them cooled. He looked down at her, his jaw tightening. "I am the attending physician on this floor, Clara, not you." His voice was low, designed to travel just far enough to sting. "I don't order expensive cardiac panels because a nurse has a bad feeling about a homeless man's jaw wake. Do you know what our wait times are doing to my metrics? Discharge him." Clara swallowed. The metallic taste of old coffee turned bitter in her mouth. She could just do it. She could print the paperwork, hand Arthur his muddy jacket, and watch him walk out the sliding glass doors into the freezing rain. If he dropped dead in the parking lot, it wouldn't be on her license. Collins had signed the chart. She was covered. She needed this job. Her daughter's braces were due for a tightening next week, and her car's transmission was making a grinding noise. The smart, safe thing to do was shut her mouth, follow the order, and survive the shift. "Dr. Collins," she started, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. Collins didn't even turn around. He was already walking back toward the break room, lifting a hand in a dismissive wave to the charge nurse across the room. "Ignore the night nurse, Brenda," Collins called out, loud enough for half the floor to hear. "She's letting her imagination write prescriptions again. Get Bay 6 cleared. I'm taking a 20-minute power nap." Clara sat in the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light. The hum of the overhead fixtures felt like a physical pressure against her eardrums. She looked over at Bay 6. The curtain was partially drawn, but she could see Arthur's worn, mud-caked boots resting on the foot of the bed. They were perfectly still. She grabbed a pair of latex gloves from the wall dispenser. They snapped against her wrists with a sharp, definitive crack. The air inside Bay 6 felt dense. It smelled of damp wool, aged sweat, and a faint, metallic tang, like a handful of dirty pennies. Arthur was sitting exactly as Clara had left him, rigidly upright, his thick, calloused hands resting on his knees. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt that had seen better decades, and a canvas jacket frayed at the cuffs. His face was a map of deep, weathered lines, but his eyes were startlingly clear. They were a pale, washed-out blue, and they watched Clara with an unsettling calm as she slipped through the curtain. "Doctor says I'm fit to leave," Arthur stated. His voice was gravelly, a low rumble that vibrated in the small space. He didn't ask it as a question. Clara stepped closer. She noted the sheen of moisture on his upper lip, the way his breathing was just a fraction too shallow. "The doctor thinks it's indigestion," Clara said, keeping her tone neutral. "But you don't." Arthur's eyes locked onto hers. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Clara hesitated. She looked at the discharge papers rolled tightly in her left hand. The paper was creasing under her grip. "I'm supposed to give you this antacid and send you out." Arthur gave a short, breathy huff that might have been a laugh if it hadn't ended in a subtle wince. He rubbed his left jawbone. "I've been shot twice, patched up in mud huts, and thrown out of perfectly good airplanes. I know what heartburn feels like, sweetheart. This ain't it." Clara froze. She looked at his hands again. The calluses weren't just from manual labor. They were specific. The webbing between his thumb and index finger was thickened. The knuckles were scarred. He carried himself with a quiet, terrifying stillness that suddenly made the muddy boots and ragged jacket look like a costume. "Who are you?" she asked softly. "Just a stubborn old man whose truck broke down on Route 9, Arthur said, breaking eye contact to look at the blank wall. "I'm fine. Give me the papers. I've got people coming to get me anyway." Clara looked down at the discharge form. Collins' signature was an arrogant, illegible scrawl at the bottom. "If he dies, it's on Collins," a dark, tired voice whispered in her head. "Just let it go." Clara crumpled the discharge paper. She threw it into the red biohazard bin. "Roll up your sleeve, Arthur," she said, her voice suddenly flat and authoritative. Arthur raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He unbuttoned the cuff of his flannel and pushed it up, revealing a forearm corded with muscle and a faded, unrecognizable black ink tattoo. Clara prepped the crook of his arm with an alcohol swab. The harsh chemical smell cut through the damp wool scent of the room. She didn't have a doctor's order for this. Drawing blood without an order was a fireable offense. Running a lab under a false pretense was grounds for the nursing board to suspend her license. Her hands shook slightly as she uncapped the needle. "You're shaking," Arthur noted quietly. "You're breaking a rule for me." "I break rules all the time," Clara lied. She anchored the vein with her thumb and slid the needle in. A flash of dark venous blood bloomed in the hub. She pushed the first vial onto the vacutainer. "You're going to sit here. I'm going to run this troponin level. It tests for enzymes your heart releases when it's dying. If it's normal, I'll personally buy you a coffee and kick you out. And if it's not, then I'm going to save your life and probably lose my job doing it." She popped the vial off, engaged the safety on the needle, and taped a cotton ball over the puncture. "Don't move. Don't even breathe heavily." Clara slipped out of the bay and speed-walked toward the stat lab. The corridor felt 100 miles long. Every time a door opened, she expected Collins to step out and demand to know why Bay 6 wasn't empty. She shoved the vial into the pneumatic tube system, punched in the priority code, and hit send. The tube sucked the sample up into the ceiling with a loud, aggressive thwump. Now, the waiting began. 20 minutes. That was the fastest the lab could process a high-sensitivity troponin. For 20 minutes, Clara paced the nurse's station. She charted useless data just to look busy. She restocked the crash cart. Her mouth was completely dry, her tongue feeling like sandpaper against her teeth. At exactly 18 minutes, Dr. Collins emerged from the break room. He was rubbing his eyes, his hair slightly rumpled. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, took a sip, and grimaced. He looked across the floor and stopped. His eyes locked onto the curtain of Bay 6. It was still drawn. The monitor above the bay was still blinking with Arthur's vitals. Collins set his coffee down. It hit the counter with a sharp clack. He walked toward Clara, his posture rigid. "Clara," his voice was dangerously quiet. "Why is the vagrant still in 6? I told you to discharge him half an hour ago." Clara stood up. Her knees felt hollow. He was waiting for a ride. "I didn't want to throw him out into the rain." "This is an emergency room, not a shelter," Collins snapped, stepping closer. The smell of his spearmint gum and expensive cologne turned Clara's stomach. "You deliberately ignored a direct medical order. You undermined my authority on my floor. Pack up your locker. I'm calling the nursing supervisor right now." Clara's vision blurred at the edges. "Pack up your locker." The words hit her like physical blows. The mortgage, the car, the years of back-breaking work. Panic flared in her chest, hot and suffocating. She opened her mouth to apologize, to beg, to say she would wheel Arthur out into the street herself. Before she could speak, a shrill, piercing alarm shattered the quiet of the ER. Beep, 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 beep. It was the critical alarm from Bay 6. Clara pushed past Collins violently, her shoulder slamming into his chest. She sprinted toward the curtain and ripped it back. Arthur was no longer sitting upright. He had collapsed backward against the pillows. His jaw was locked tight, his hands clawing at his chest, tearing the flannel shirt open. His skin wasn't gray anymore. It was a mottled, ghastly blue. His eyes were rolled back, showing the whites. Clara looked at the monitor. The steady rhythm she had watched earlier was gone. The green line was jumping violently in wide, chaotic spikes. VTAC, ventricular tachycardia. His heart wasn't pumping blood. It was just quivering. He was moments away from cardiac arrest. "Code blue, Bay 6, Clara screamed, her voice tearing through the department. She slammed the button to drop the head of the bed, her hands moving purely on muscle memory. She didn't feel the fear anymore. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical hyper-focus. Collins stood frozen at the edge of the curtain, his eyes wide, his coffee forgotten. He looked at the monitor, then down at the dying man. The arrogance had completely drained from his face, leaving only the terrified expression of a boy who didn't know what to do. "Don't just stand there," Clara barked, grabbing the defibrillator pads from the wall. She ripped the backing off the sticky gel. "Get the crash cart. Push 1 milligram of epinephrine. Move." In the distance, over the screaming of the cardiac monitor, Clara heard the heavy, synchronized thud of boots entering the ER waiting room. But she didn't care. She planted her hands on Arthur's chest and began to push. 2 inches deep, 100 beats a minute. The physical reality of cardiopulmonary resuscitation is brutal, an assault on the human body masquerading as a rescue. The night nurse leaned her entire upper body weight over the narrow gurney, locking her elbows, driving the heels of her hands into the center of the old man's chest. Crunch. The sound of his sternum fracturing under her pressure was sickeningly loud in the cramped bay, like heavy boots stepping on dry kindling. She didn't stop. You never stop. Sweat broke across her forehead, stinging her eyes, mixing with the stale dust of the shift. Her triceps burned with a hot lactic acid fire. "Bag him," she screamed, her lungs burning, the calm, professional veneer completely shattered by the violence of keeping a human heart pumping manually. Collins remained glued to the floor tiles. His expensive, polished leather loafers were rooted in place. His face had drained to the color of old chalk, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The pristine algorithms and textbook scenarios from his residency hadn't accounted for this, the sheer, terrifying messiness of a dying human crashing directly in front of him. He was paralyzed by the realization of his own fatal error. Collins, Brenda, the veteran charge nurse, barreled through the curtain, nearly ripping the heavy fabric off its track. She shoved the heavy crash cart against the wall, the metal drawers rattling violently against each other. "Get out of the damn way!" Brenda threw her hip into Collins, knocking the doctor aside, and grabbed the plastic ombu bag. She clamped the mask over the patient's gray, unmoving face, sealing it tightly against his nose and mouth. "Squeeze, squeeze. Pads are on," the night nurse grunted, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. "Rhythm check," Brenda ordered, her voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. The night nurse lifted her hands, hovering them an inch above the patient's bruised chest. The monitor above them hesitated, the green line tracing a jagged, meaningless scribble before settling into a rapid, chaotic wave. Ventricular fibrillation. The heart was a bag of worms, quivering uselessly, failing to push a single drop of oxygenated blood to the brain. V-fib, charging to 200 joules, Brenda barked. She slammed her thumb onto the defibrillator console. The machine emitted a rising, high-pitched whine that set the hair on the back of the neck on edge. It was the sound of concentrated violence. Clear. Everyone stepped back, throwing their hands up. Brenda pressed the shock button. The heavy bed frame violently shuddered as 200 joules of electricity slammed through the old man's chest. His back arched off the mattress, a rigid, unnatural spasm, before he slammed back down into the thin pillows. The smell of singed chest hair and heated conductive gel, a sharp, chemical ozone scent, immediately clouded the small space, masking the smell of damp wool. They looked at the screen. The green line flatlined for 2 agonizing, endless seconds. A single beat, spiked, then another. The wave widened, organizing itself, morphing slowly back into a fragile, rapid sinus tachycardia. "We have a pulse," the night nurse breathed. Her hands were shaking so severely she had to grip the cold metal of the bed rail to stay upright. The adrenaline was peaking, making her vision swim at the edges. Just then, the pneumatic tube station on the wall outside the bay spat out a plastic canister with a heavy, aggressive thwack. Brenda reached out and cracked it open, unfurling the Stat Lab printout. Her eyes scanned the numbers, and her jaw tightened. "Troponin is through the roof," Brenda said, her voice dropping a fraction, the gravity of the numbers anchoring her tone. "He's having a massive anterior myocardial infarction, a widowmaker." Collins finally found his voice. It cracked, high and thin in his throat. I didn't order a cardiac panel." "I did," the night nurse said. She wiped a streak of sweat from her cheek with the back of a bloody, gloved wrist, staring a hole through the young attending. "Good thing I broke your rules, doctor, or you'd be filling out a death certificate and explaining to the morbidity board why you discharged a widowmaker with an antacid." Before Collins could formulate a defense, before he could weaponize his authority to mask his incompetence, the ambient atmospheric pressure of the emergency room shifted. The usual background drone, the coughing, the low murmurs, the squeaking cartwheels, the distant beeping of IV pumps, was suddenly overpowered by a new, localized sound. It was the synchronized, heavy thud of combat boots hitting the sticky linoleum. Fast. Urgent. Deliberate. The sliding glass doors of the ambulance bay didn't just open. They were forced apart and held wide by two men in dark, weather-resistant tactical gear. The cold, wet air of the storm violently rushed into the stifling, overheated ER, carrying the sharp scent of freezing rain and diesel exhaust. "Secure the corridor. Nobody moves." The voice wasn't a yell, but it possessed a terrifying, absolute authority that immediately silenced the waiting room. 4 uniformed military police officers fanned out across the triage area, completely ignoring the staring civilians and terrified administrative staff. Their movements were perfectly choreographed, their hands resting deliberately on the retention hoods of their holsters. Following them was a tall woman in a crisp, dark army dress uniform. A silver eagle sat heavy on her shoulder board. A colonel. The rainwater beaded on her uniform, catching the harsh, fluorescent light. She didn't stop at the triage desk. She didn't look at the signage. She walked with predatory purpose directly toward the flashing critical light above Bay 6. Collins stepped out of the bay. He yanked at the lapels of his rumpled white coat, desperately trying to physically reassemble his shattered authority. The sudden, overwhelming military presence seemed to short-circuit his brain, leaving him grasping at the only metric he understood: hospital hierarchy. "Excuse me," Collins puffed his chest out, stepping into the colonel's path. "This is a restricted clinical area. You cannot just storm in here. We are managing a critical—" The colonel didn't blink. She didn't slow her stride. One of the military police officers simply shifted his weight, driving a hard, unyielding shoulder into Collins. The young doctor stumbled backward. His expensive loafers skidded on the sticky linoleum, his back hitting the wall hard enough to knock the wind out of him in a sharp wheeze. The colonel pushed past the curtain. Her analytical gaze swept the cramped space. She catalogued the bloody gauze on the floor, the open crash cart, the metallic smell of ozone and singed hair, the terrified attending, and finally, the frail, unconscious man on the narrow mattress. For a single microsecond, the iron composure on the colonel's face slipped. A raw, unfiltered dread pinched the corners of her eyes. Then, the mask snapped back into place. "Sitrep," she demanded. Her voice was cracking ice. She looked directly at Brenda, instantly identifying the most competent person in the room. "Massive anterior MI," Brenda responded. "VTAC, degraded to VFib. Administered 1 shock at 200 joules. Pushed 1 milligram of epi. We have a return of spontaneous circulation, but his pressure is tanking. He needs a cath lab 10 minutes ago. My transport team is 60 seconds out. We are airlifting him to Walter Reed," the colonel stated, tapping a secure comms unit in her ear. "Prepare for a hard transfer." "Hold on." Collins pushed his way back into the bay, his neck flushing violently red. Humiliation briefly overrode his self-preservation. "I am the attending physician. You cannot move a highly unstable cardiac patient without my authorization. He is an unidentified vagrant, and I have not approved." "A vagrant?" The colonel turned. The sheer disdain radiating from her was a physical weight. She looked at Collins, as if he were a particularly foul biological spill. "Doctor, do you have any concept of who is lying on that bed?" "A John Doe," Collins stammered. "He wandered in smelling like a wet dog. He's lucky we—" The colonel closed the distance between them. She was shorter than the doctor, but she consumed all the oxygen in the room. "That vagrant is General Jonathan Hayes," she said, her voice dropping to a lethal, razor-thin whisper. "Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His transport lost traction and rolled in a dead zone returning from Camp David. He walked 3 miles in freezing rain, in the dark, with a torn artery in his heart, to reach your hospital." Collins' mouth opened. A pathetic, choked wheeze escaped. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him sickly and hollow. The discharge papers he had signed were currently sitting in the red biohazard bin. He had actively tried to throw the highest-ranking military officer in the armed forces out into the storm because he wanted a nap. If he had died in your waiting room, the colonel continued, I wouldn't just sue this hospital into dust. I would personally ensure your medical license was burned to ash. You would spend your natural life answering to a federal tribunal. She turned away, erasing his existence entirely. She looked past Brenda, her eyes settling on the night nurse. The nurse leaned heavily against the bedrail. Her scrubs were glued to her skin with sweat. Her hands throbbed with a deep, bruising ache from the violent compressions. The massive adrenaline crash was hollowing out her chest, leaving a cold, shaking exhaustion in its wake. Who ran the code? The colonel asked quietly. She did, Brenda said, nodding to the night nurse. The doctor ordered a discharge. She ran a high-sensitivity troponin against orders. She started compressions before anyone else realized he crashed. The colonel looked at the night nurse. She took in the bruised exhaustion under the nurse's eyes and the fraying edges of her cheap scrubs. She didn't offer a cinematic speech or a salute. She just gave a slow, deliberate nod. You defied an order to do the right thing, the colonel said softly. That requires backbone. I won't forget it. The ER doors blew open again. A specialized military medical team rushed in with a motorized transport gurney. The localized mess of the community hospital was instantly swallowed by synchronized military precision. They moved the general in seconds, hooking him to their own advanced monitors and sweeping out of the emergency room as fast as they arrived. The bay fell into a deafening silence. Collins remained pinned against the wall. He stared blankly at the empty bed, the arrogant foundation of his career completely pulverized. Medicine wasn't a spreadsheet. He looked at the night nurse, his eyes wide, waiting for her to gloat or scream. She didn't have the energy. The night nurse walked over to the biohazard bin. She stepped on the pedal, retrieved the crumpled discharge paperwork with Collins' signature, and flattened it against her thigh. She walked over and placed it neatly onto his clipboard. Your power nap is over, doctor, she said, her voice entirely deadpan. She walked to the wall dispenser. Fresh latex gloves snapped against her wrists with a sharp, familiar crack. Bay 6 needs bleaching, she called out to the floor, turning her back on the ruined doctor. We have a waiting room full of people. The linoleum was still sticky. Her lower back still throbbed. It was 4:12 a.m., and the shift wasn't over. If the intense, split-second decisions of this ER code had your heart racing, you know exactly why experienced nurses are the true backbone of the hospital. Drop a like if you loved seeing a dedicated nurse. Trust her gut and put an arrogant doctor in his place. Share this story with anyone who appreciates gritty medical dramas and poetic justice, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more gripping, high-stakes narratives. See you in the next video.
Hi, my name is Jeffrey Williams, the owner and manager of Second Ember Reborn. After watching the video, ignore the night nurse, the ear doctor Scoffed. Until a 4-star general arrived, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the quiet courage Clara showed when it would have been easier to follow orders and look the other way. The story highlights how experience, compassion, and paying attention to people can matter just as much as titles or authority. Have you ever seen someone speak up when everyone else stayed silent? And what was the moment in this story that stood out to you the most? In everyday life, maybe it's a reminder to listen a little more carefully and not dismiss people too quickly. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy these kinds of nurse-centered stories, feel free to like or subscribe for more.